One thing I like to do in my free time is look at one-star reviews for famous landmarks. And when I was looking at one-star reviews for Mount Rushmore, there were two things. This one guy was mad that it started raining when he got there, so he asked the employees to turn off the rain, but they didn't listen. And another one, and also the important one, were several reviews from people complaining that Mount Rushmore was carved into a sacred Indian mountain, and that we stole all of our lands from the natives. And they're wrong. I'd argue that we stole the whole country. We stole the 13 colonies from the British, we paid France to steal Louisiana, and we stole Texas and the entire Southwest from Mexico. We only stole this tiny piece from the natives, so stop overreacting. In all seriousness, though, the American Manifest Destiny was a bloody conquest, where, honestly, land was stolen. And this is how we did it.
One thing you will discover when you get next to one another is everybody.
After the American Revolution, the 14th Treaty of Paris ever held in history was to be signed. After almost a year of negotiations, the treaty was the following. Britain would recognize the independence of the United States, and Britain would also agree to give up this land west of the original 13 colonies, which the British insisted was exceedingly generous of the United Kingdom. And they also broke their promise to the natives that they made 50 years ago that said, no one can settle past this line. The Spanish-American border also became the Mississippi River. Now that the U.S. has all this land, what do they do with it? Well, they expanded the original states a little bit to the borders we know today, except for West Virginia, which wouldn't become a state until the Civil War. And also what is now Kentucky and Tennessee being part of Virginia and North Carolina respectively, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go back. Two things you might not have known. One, the United States had several presidents before Washington, but none of these terms lasted for more than a year. And two, the reason Delaware is called the first state is that after the war, all U.S. states were briefly made into territories, but all later became states, except for the Northwest Territory and this unorganized territory in Alabama and Mississippi. Another thing I was surprised to find in my research is that Connecticut originally claimed this part of northern Ohio, even though they don't even border Ohio. Only in Ohio. Shut up! There are also some border disputes with Britain still. The first is in Maine. Britain believes that the border is here, but the United States believes that it goes up here so that they have access to the St. Lawrence River. This dispute would not be settled until 1839, with the U.S. and Britain having a little skirmish called the Aroostook War, where they both agreed to make the border along the St. Croix River. There was also a dispute on the Minnesota border. Before we continue, I should probably mention how a territory works, because that stuff is essential for this story. A U.S. territory is a piece of land that is owned by a country, in this case the United States, and its citizens are citizens of that country, but the territory is not self-governing, usually administered by the army. Over in Europe, the continent is at war. Napoleon Bonaparte has just taken control of France, and there have been several coalitions against Napoleon, all of which failed. France regained its old Louisiana territories in 1800 after it lost them to the 7 Years' War. By 1803, Napoleon had lost interest in having an empire throughout North America, plus he was low on money, and having no money is not fun, especially when you're at war. So France offered the United States to buy Louisiana from them for a total of $342 million in today's money. That's as much as an apartment in San Francisco. The Louisiana Purchase was important because it gave the United States more room to expand and develop. Thomas Jefferson, the president at the time, wanted the U.S. to explore its new lands and maybe also some Spanish territory, so he organized an expedition led by Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition also hired a certain Shoshone woman named Sacagawea to guide them through the treacherous terrain. The Lewis and Clark expedition reached the Pacific coast in 1806. Next up, the War of 1812. The United States did not gain anything from the War of 1812, but its goal was to take the rest of Canada from the British. The United States believed that it was their destiny, given by God himself, that they should win the war. The War of 1812 started after the British seized several American ships, causing the U.S. to declare war on them. It's heavily contested who won the War of 1812. Americans claim that they won, completely ignoring the fact that the British burned down Washington, D.C., and the British and Canadians claim they won, completely ignoring the fact that the Americans managed to invade Canada. By 1814, the map of the United States looked like this. The next major manifesting of destiny wouldn't happen until 1819, when Spain agreed to give Florida to the United States. Florida had become a safe haven for escaped slaves, so you can imagine that they weren't too happy about that. Speaking of slavery still exists, but there is hope. The Underground Railroad, which was neither underground nor a railroad, was a way where anti-slavery Southerners could take in escaped slaves for the night on their way to the abolitionist North. Another thing that happened also in 1819 was a treaty signed by the U.S. and Britain where they redrew their border. It was agreed that the border would go from the northwesternmost point of the Lake of the Woods, pictured here, down south to the 49th parallel, where it would continue to the Rocky Mountains. From there, it would run across the range down to the newly redrawn border with Spain. There was also a question of what to do with Oregon. The United States proposed that the border continues along the 49th parallel to the Pacific so that they could get access to the lucrative fur trade in the area. The British proposed that the border went along the Columbia River so that they had access to the lucrative fur trade in the area. They eventually decided on a joint occupation of the area until they could get their crap together. Let's take a pit stop in Africa. The United States has established a colony in present-day Liberia. Actually, it was an organization called the American Colonization Society, operating on behalf of the United States. The ACS used Liberia to send slaves back to Africa. Slave owners believed that it was necessary to relocate some dangerous slaves to Africa to prevent slave rebellions. What a great idea. Oh, if my dog's gonna run away, I better get rid of him so he can't run away from me. Before we come back to America, let's talk about Mexico. In 1821, Mexico declared their independence from Spain, becoming the Mexican Empire, and then the United States of Mexico 2 years later. During the United States of Mexico's reign, they abolished slavery. Some American Southerners living in Texas said, "We hate abolition, so we're going to declare independence, and there's nothing you can do about it." There was. The United States of Mexico, now the Mexican Republic, led by Santa Anna, went to war in the Texan War for Independence, home to the famous Battle of the Alamo. The two sides sort of stopped fighting, but Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas. In the meantime, Texas started cozying up with the United States, offering for them to annex them. America said no because they couldn't risk war with Mexico at the moment. This changed with the election of William Henry Harrison, who was pro-annexation. Now you're probably thinking, if Texans want to leave the Union so badly now, why did they want America to annex them back then? And that's a great question. You see, back then, Texas didn't look like this. It looked like this. Most Texans believed that Texas wouldn't survive on its own. So wouldn't it be nice if a major power who was sympathetic to us and also spoke the same language as us annexed us? And that's exactly what happened. On February 19, 1846, the United States of America formally annexed the Republic of Texas. Mexico was outraged by this because as far as they were concerned, America just annexed Mexican territory, so they sent troops into Texas. This was the beginning of the Mexican-American War. The Americans fought well, pushing into the southwest, and even occupying Mexico City for a time. Fun fact about the Mexican-American War, the governor of the Mexican state of Yucatan begged the United States to annex them, which would have been great for me 171 years later, because then I probably wouldn't have to worry about drinking the tap water in Mexico. Anyways, the war ended in 1848 with an American victory. The U.S. gained all of this land from Mexico, so now the settlers have a lot more room to grow. Also, Britain and America stopped bickering and settled on a border in Oregon. The settlers came to the new American lands for a new life. In California, a man named John Sutter is building a sawmill, so he asks an employee of his to go build some poles by the river. "You there, boy, go build stuff." Okay. Hey, I found gold. Whoa. We probably shouldn't tell anyone about this. Yeah, that's a good idea. What's that noise? People called 49ers traveled across the United States and the world to California in the hopes of striking it rich. Businessmen followed them out there, including a man named Levi Strauss, a German immigrant. Strauss thought to himself in a thick German accent,
"They thought if the miners had pants that stayed dry instead of these pieces of garbage."
And so he started a jeans company, which is still around today as Levi's Jeans. Similar stories happen across California, with some men getting richer than if they had come in search of gold. The native people were affected negatively by the gold rush, however, because when a bunch of smelly old men come through town, you're bound to get a disease at some point. And some Americans in California thought, Well, if they're dying, why not just kill them? So they started the California Genocide. Speaking of natives, the government has been fighting against natives since independence. You had the Seminole Wars, the plot of that really good book that I read that one time that had the N-word in it for some reason. The Seminole Wars were led by, God forgive me for saying this word, Andrew Jackson. And there was also the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is actually only an hour's drive from where I live. California was granted statehood in 1850, becoming the first Western state. Oregon followed soon after in 1859. Alright, America, you have your modern borders for the lower 48. What do you want to... Oh. The Civil War happened. General Winfield Scott, who in my opinion, along with Grant, was the best Civil War general, proposed the Anaconda Plan, where the capture of the Mississippi River and a naval blockade would strangle and choke out the Confederacy. You know, like an anaconda. The Civil War is important for two reasons. One, after the war, Union veterans and Southerners who were still salty about losing headed west. And two, this little side tangent I wanted to go on, where I talked about Southern plans for Manifest Destiny. The Knights of the Golden Circle was founded in 1854 by a northern pro-slavery man named George W.L. Buckley. The KGC planned that the South should secede, which that actually did happen, legalize slavery, that happened too, annex all of Mexico, take over the Caribbean islands and Central America, and invade Venezuela. Imagine a world where that actually happens. In 1863 in Nebraska, the Transcontinental Railroad begins construction. This is important because the railroad allows settlers to easily get to the west. This railroad wouldn't be completed until 1869, though. Another important thing to talk about is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act said that if a settler can reach a 160-acre plot of land and live on it for 5 years while also farming on that land, then he and his family can own it. This was huge because it was basically free land. Settlers flocked to the west in hundreds of thousands and founded small towns. These towns also anticipated the aforementioned Transcontinental Railroad coming through, so they built towns in front of it with train stations. Some of these towns missed the railroad by several miles, so there were some cases where people would move their towns. Over time, more railroads would spring up across the U.S. This began the period known as the Wild West. Back in 1856, in Europe, Russia lost the Crimean War to the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. Russia now has no money, so they decide to sell their Alaskan colony. But to who? Certainly not the British. They just lost a war to them. So how about the United States? In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $140 million in modern money. Now the United States can chill out. This was the golden age of the Wild West. Think John Wayne in Red Dead Redemption 2, and then multiply that by like 3 gold rushes. That's what we're talking about here. By this time, all of the territories were divided up into the modern state borders we know and love today. But we're still missing one thing: Hawaii. The United States had been getting friendly with the Kingdom of Hawaii, and they wanted their land because... America! Yeah! In 1893, some American officers, as well as Sanford Ballard Dole, the founder of the Dole Food Company, they overthrew the government of Hawaii. Hawaii would later become a territory in 1898. Speaking of 1898, Spanish-American War. In Havana Harbor, the USS Maine exploded, most likely due to an accident in the boiler room, but the United States blamed Spain for it, so they went to war. One Teddy Roosevelt later, and now the U.S. owns the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and all these Spanish islands in the Pacific. Cuba would later gain independence in 1902, followed by the Philippines in 1945. Well, there you have it. Manifest Destiny. This video took a long time to make, so please consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you for watching, and this has been Playhouse Films.